The flour scattered across Duchess Elinor's blue gown like ash when Duke Nathaniel emptied the evidence at her feet. Lord Silas Vale claimed the spoiled grain had been discovered in a storehouse controlled by Elinor. Before the assembled tenants, Nathaniel accused his wife of manufacturing hunger so they would depend upon her, and ordered every lease she had approved destroyed. Elinor lost her office before she was permitted to examine a single sack. 7 families occupied Blackmere Mill in protest, taking enough flour to survive the coming week. Nathaniel called them thieves and instructed his bailiffs to surround the building. No one would enter, no one would leave. But Elinor knew the mill better than any man outside it. Through an abandoned water passage, she reached the families and inspected the alleged stolen grain. Each sack carried her personal inventory mark. Each mark was perfect, too perfect, because the iron stamp that made it had been buried with her former miller 6 months earlier. Hours before that discovery, the great hall of Blackmere had been prepared for the annual harvest dinner. Long tables stretched beneath the portraits of Nathaniel's ancestors, although there was scarcely enough wholesome grain left on the estate to provide bread for the guests. Elinor had asked for the celebration to be postponed. Nathaniel had refused. "The neighboring landowners will attend," he had said that morning. "If we cancel, they will assume Blackmere is failing." "Blackmere is failing," Elinor had answered. "Not because the harvest was poor, but because grain is disappearing between the fields and our storehouses." She had placed 3 account books on his desk. The first recorded every cart that left the northern fields. The second listed the quantities received at the granaries. The third showed what reached the mill. The figures should have agreed. They did not. Nathaniel had barely opened the first volume before Lord Silas Vale entered the room. Vale had become indispensable to the Duke during the previous year. He dressed soberly, spoke softly, and possessed the useful talent of making ruthless proposals sound like unavoidable arithmetic. He had promised to clear Nathaniel's debts, increase the estate's rents, and secure him enough influence to obtain a royal appointment. He had also spent months teaching Nathaniel to regard every objection from his wife as a challenge to his authority. "Your Grace," Vale had said, glancing at the books, "the missing grain has already been found. Now, before tenants, neighboring gentlemen, and servants, 2 footmen dragged forward 3 damp sacks. Vale cut one open. Blackened wheat spilled across the polished floor, releasing a sour odor of mold. This was discovered in the old western storehouse," he announced. The door was locked. Her Grace possessed the only key. Elinor looked toward Nathaniel. "I surrendered that key to Mr. Vale in April, when you placed the western stores under his inspection." Vale's expression remained composed. "There is no record of that transfer." "There is, in the household inventory." "The inventory written by your own hand?" A murmur moved through the hall. Elinor understood the trap. Every record she had kept could now be described as evidence she had manufactured. She stepped toward the open sack. "Allow me to examine the grain." Nathaniel blocked her path. His face revealed no uncertainty, but she saw the tension in his jaw. He knew how often her calculations had saved Blackmere. He knew she could distinguish wheat spoiled by damp from wheat deliberately soaked after storage. That was his moment to choose. He chose Vale. "You will not touch the evidence," Nathaniel said. "You have interfered enough." Vale produced 7 folded leases bearing the estate seal. Elinor recognized the names immediately. Ruth Mercer, Thomas Bell, the Palmer brothers, and 4 other families whose labor kept the mill operating. Each agreement granted secure tenancy in exchange for fixed rents and maintenance of the waterways. "Nathaniel, those leases prevent Vale from raising the rents during a failed harvest," Elinor said. "That is why he wants them invalidated. They were issued without my knowledge. They were signed in your library. You read the first 2 yourself. I remember signing renewals, not granting my tenants the right to defy their landlord." Elinor stared at him. Vale had not forged Nathaniel's signature. He had persuaded him to deny understanding what he had willingly signed. Nathaniel lifted the first lease and tore it down the center. Ruth Mercer made a small, wounded sound from among the tenants. She had lost her husband in the mill accident that killed the former miller, Gideon Pike. Her cottage would now pass into Vale's control. Nathaniel tore the remaining agreements one after another. "You are relieved of all responsibility for the mill, the granaries, and the tenant accounts," he told Elinor. "Your allowance will be suspended until the missing grain is recovered. And these families? They will surrender their cottages at the end of the week." Vale lowered his eyes to hide his satisfaction. Elinor looked at the spoiled wheat around her shoes. Beneath its moldy odor, she detected something sharper. Vinegar. Someone had accelerated the decay. Before she could say so, The mill bell began to ring, not the measured summons announcing work or fire. This was the violent, continuous alarm used when the great wheel threatened to break. A breathless bailiff entered the hall. "The mill has been seized, Your Grace. The 7 families have barred the doors and taken flour from the reserve." Nathaniel's humiliation hardened instantly into anger. "Surround the building," he ordered. "No one passes." "They are frightened," Elinor said. "Let me speak to them. You will remain here." But remaining obedient would condemn 7 families for a theft she no longer believed had occurred. After darkness fell, Elinor changed from her stained dinner gown into an old wool dress and left through the servants' stair. She crossed the orchard alone, descended the muddy bank, and crawled into the disused channel beneath the mill. Ruth Mercer pulled her through an iron hatch. Inside, frightened children huddled beside extinguished lanterns, while their parents guarded the doors with farming tools. Flour dust hung in the air. The great wheel stood silent. "We took only what your ledger said belonged to us," Ruth whispered. "But the bailiffs claim these are the same sacks found in the western storehouse." Elinor knelt beside them. The wheat inside was clean. Its inventory marks identified it as part of the emergency reserve she had sealed after the previous harvest. The markings were precise: an E, a sheaf of wheat, and a narrow crescent cut along the border. Her fingers went cold. Gideon Pike had made that stamp for her. After his death, Elinor had placed it in his coffin because he had once joked that no dishonest steward would ever use his tools. Yet someone had stamped these sacks recently. The lampblack in the impressions was still fresh enough to stain her thumb. A heavy blow struck the outer door. "By order of the Duke of Blackmere," a bailiff shouted. "Open this mill." Another blow shook flour from the rafters. Then Ruth seized Elinor's wrist. "If the stamp was buried with Mr. Pike," she whispered, "you must see what we found beneath the grinding floor." She lifted one of the boards. Below it lay a mud-covered coat, a rusted lantern, and the unmistakable brass handle of Gideon Pike's coffin. Elinor lowered the lantern through the opening. The brass handle was still attached to a splintered length of black-painted wood. Beside it lay several scraps of rotting velvet and a strip of linen darkened by mud. There was no body. Ruth Mercer covered her mouth. "Was he buried beneath the mill?" "No." Elinor crouched beside the opening. "Gideon was buried in the churchyard." She remembered standing beside the grave 6 months earlier as rain ran from the brim of Nathaniel's hat. The coffin had been sealed before the funeral. Vale had said the miller's injuries were too severe for anyone to view him. Elinor had accepted that explanation. Another blow struck the outer door. One of its wooden braces cracked. "Your Grace!" the bailiff shouted. "His Grace commands you to come out immediately." Elinor looked around the mill. 7 families waited for her decision. Some clutched tools, others held their children. If Nathaniel's men entered by force, terror could become violence within seconds. "No one raises a weapon," she said, "not even if they break through." Thomas Bell tightened his grip on a grain shovel. "Then they will drag us to the gale. Not if I give them something more important to guard." She removed the fresh flour mark from her thumb with a handkerchief, folded the stained fabric, and concealed it inside her bodice. Then she covered the opening with the loose board. "Ruth, hide the sacks bearing my mark. Keep one where the bailiffs can find it." Ruth stared at her. "You want them to take it?" "I want to know where they carry it." Elinor crossed to the door and instructed the tenants to remove the braces. When it opened, 12 bailiffs stood outside with clubs and lanterns. Nathaniel waited behind them on horseback, still dressed for the interrupted dinner. Vale sat on a gray gelding at his side. Nathaniel's gaze fixed upon Elinor. "You disobeyed me." "Yes." The single word unsettled him more than an excuse would have done. Vale pointed toward the mill. "Search every floor, recover the stolen grain, and arrest whoever resists." "The families surrendered peacefully," Elinor said. "You have no need to arrest them. They occupied His Grace's property. They operate this mill. Without them, Blackmere will have no flour within 4 days." Nathaniel dismounted and approached her. "You are no longer steward. Your opinion is not required." "Then ask Vale which of his gentlemen knows how to dress the stones, regulate the sluice, or repair a broken cog." For a moment, no one spoke. Nathaniel knew the answer. Vale's clerks could calculate rent, but none could operate the mill. The 7 condemned families possessed skills Blackmere could not replace before its remaining grain spoiled. Vale leaned toward the Duke. "A public retreat will only encourage further rebellion." Nathaniel's face hardened. "The men will be held overnight. The women and children may return to their cottages." "You tore up their leases," Elinor said. "If they leave this building, Vale's agents can lock them out. They will be permitted to return. Give that order in writing." Vale smiled faintly. Her Grace appears determined to govern through conditions. "No," Elinor replied. "I am determined to remember your promises after you forget them." Nathaniel drew a slow breath. She had seen that expression during the early years of their marriage, when he fought to master his temper. Back then, he had sometimes listened before anger conquered judgment. This time, he turned to his secretary. "Write the order." Vale's smile vanished. While the secretary prepared it, the bailiffs entered the mill. Elinor watched two men carry out the deliberately exposed sack. Vale immediately instructed them to place it in his wagon rather than with the other recovered grain. Exactly as she had hoped. When the tenants were escorted away, Nathaniel caught Elinor's arm. "You will ride back with me. I will walk. It is nearly midnight, and I would rather spend the hour considering why your new steward is transporting evidence to his private warehouse." Nathaniel glanced toward the wagon. "The sack must be secured. It came from your emergency reserve, not the Western storehouse. You had several minutes inside the mill. You could have altered it." His accusation was quiet, but it wounded more deeply than the humiliation in the hall. Elinor pulled her arm free. "You believe I spoiled your grain, forged leases, provoked your tenants, and then risked entering a barricaded mill merely to deceive you again? I believe you are desperate to retain authority. I was trying to retain food." Nathaniel looked away first. Vale called to him from the road. "Your Grace, we should leave before the tenants gather." Nathaniel mounted without offering Elinor further protection. The riders departed with the wagon between them. Elinor waited until their lanterns became small points beyond the orchard. Then she followed at a distance, using the hedgerows for cover. At the fork leading toward Blackmere House, Nathaniel and most of the bailiffs turned east. Vale's wagon went west. Elinor followed it along a neglected cart road until the trees opened around an abandoned malt house. Two men unlocked the building and carried the marked sack inside. Vale entered behind them. Through a broken shutter, Elinor saw rows of grain sacks stacked almost to the ceiling. Blackmere's missing reserve had not been sold or destroyed. It had been concealed less than 3 miles from the estate. Vale approached a table where another man was cleaning an iron object with a rag. Even from outside, Elinor recognized the crescent cut along its edge, her inventory stamp. "You should never have used it again," Vale said. The Duchess notices details. The other man turned toward the lamplight. Elinor gripped the windowsill to keep herself from making a sound. A scar crossed his forehead, but the broad shoulders and silver-streaked beard were unmistakable. Gideon Pike, the miller they had buried 6 months earlier, was alive. Gideon Pike placed the iron stamp on the table. "Then you should have left it in the grave," he said. Vale removed his gloves with deliberate care, and allowed the Duchess to prove that every marked sack was genuine. "We needed her seal upon the grain. You needed it once. Using it again was vanity." "No, it was necessity. Those families took clean wheat from the mill. By morning, that wheat must appear to have come from the spoiled Western storehouse." Gideon's face tightened. "There are children in those cottages. There are children everywhere. Their hunger does not alter the contract." Elinor pressed closer to the broken shutter. On the table beside the stamp lay a leather ledger, several blank inventory labels, and a bottle of dark liquid. The sharp smell drifting through the gap was the same one she had detected in the Great Hall. Vinegar. Vale was manufacturing spoiled grain and using her mark to connect it to her stores. "Lord Mowbray's wagons arrive in 9 days," Vale continued. "Until then, no one touches the reserve. And when Blackmere cannot feed itself, His Grace will borrow against the Southern Valley. The tenants will be removed, the leases extinguished, and the land transferred to our creditors." Gideon stared at the stacks surrounding them. "You told me the grain was being withheld to raise its price. It will raise the price. You said nothing about taking their land." Vale's voice cooled. "You were paid to disappear, copy the Duchess's mark, and alter the mill tallies. Do not burden yourself with matters beyond your station." Gideon picked up the stamp, closing his fist around it. Elinor felt a glimmer of hope. He was guilty, but perhaps not beyond persuasion. If she could reach him alone, he might reveal who had falsified the accounts and how Vale intended to seize the valley. A floorboard creaked behind her. Before she could turn, a hand clamped over her mouth. Elinor drove her elbow backward. Her attacker grunted but held on, dragging her away from the shutter. She stamped hard upon his boot and twisted free. It was Daniel Crowe, one of Vale's clerks, the same man who had carried the marked sack from the mill. "You should have obeyed your husband," he hissed. Elinor ran. Branches tore at her dress as she plunged into the trees. Crow followed, calling for the men inside the malt house. A door slammed open. Lantern light swept across the undergrowth. Elinor knew the estate paths, but darkness turned every route into a trap. She reached the cart road just as a second man emerged ahead of her. Forced from the path, she scrambled down the bank toward the river. Her foot struck loose mud. She fell, sliding until her shoulder collided with a fallen trunk. Pain shot down her arm. Above, Crow's lantern appeared between the trees. "Your Grace," he called with false gentleness. "You cannot return to Blackmere like this. His Grace already believes you guilty." Elinor forced herself upright and waded into the river. The current reached her knees, then her waist. August had been dry, but the mill sluice still fed a swift central channel. She moved downstream, using the bank's shadow to conceal herself. The lanterns divided. One remained above her. Another crossed toward the footbridge. Elinor felt along the muddy bank until her fingers found the mouth of a narrow drainage culvert. She pulled herself inside and crouched in the freezing darkness while footsteps passed overhead. Vale's voice carried from the road. "Find her handkerchief, a glove, anything she might have dropped. If she reaches the house, Pike is finished." "And the Duchess?" Crow asked. A pause followed. "Her husband has already declared that she is dishonest and unstable," Vale answered. "We need only give him a reason to believe she has fled." The men moved away. Elinor remained in the culvert until her teeth began to chatter. Nathaniel's public accusation had done more than damage her reputation. It had prepared the explanation for her disappearance. If she went directly to him without evidence, Vale would call Gideon a frightened hallucination. Nathaniel might believe him again. She reached inside her bodice. The handkerchief marked with fresh lampblack remained there, but it proved only that the sacks had been stamped recently. It did not prove who had done it. She needed the ledger from Vale's table. Elinor emerged from the culvert and returned toward the malt house by a longer route. The wagon was gone when she arrived, and only one lantern burned inside. Through the shutter, she saw Gideon alone, hurriedly filling a canvas bag. He was preparing to run. Elinor stepped through the rear doorway. Gideon spun around and raised a grain hook. "Put it down," she said. The hook slipped from his hand. For several seconds, the former miller could only stare at her mud-covered dress and bleeding shoulder. "I watched your coffin lowered into the ground," Elinor said. "Whom did we bury?" "No one." Vale weighted it with stones. "And the blood on the mill floor?" "A slaughtered pig. He said I would hang if I stayed. The accident killed 2 men, and he had papers showing I neglected the wheel." "Did you?" Gideon lowered his gaze. "I followed his order to delay the repairs. He promised no one would work beneath the gearing. But 2 men did. Yes." Elinor did not soften. "You helped him fake your death. You altered my records and marked stolen grain in my name. He threatened my daughter. You have no daughter." Gideon looked toward the door. "Not one anyone at Blackmere knows about." From his bag, he removed a small silver locket. Inside was the miniature of a young woman Elinor recognized as Mary Shaw, a kitchen maid dismissed the previous winter for alleged theft. "Vale holds her somewhere near the northern canal," Gideon said. "He makes me work because he knows I will not risk her life. Then help me find her." He shook his head. "If he discovers I spoke to you, he already knows I saw you." Fear drained the color from Gideon's face. Elinor reached for the leather ledger on the table, but he caught her wrist. "That book contains only false transactions. Vale keeps the true record elsewhere." "Where?" "I have never seen it." Crow carries a black key around his neck. It opens a room beneath the old counting house. Hoofbeats sounded outside. Gideon extinguished the lantern, but it was too late. Light appeared beneath the front door. Elinor seized the iron stamp and slipped it into her pocket. Gideon led her toward a trapdoor behind the stacked grain. Before they reached it, someone knocked 3 times. "Nathaniel Vale," called a familiar voice from outside. "Open this door by order of the Duke of Blackmere." Elinor stopped breathing. It was not a bailiff. Her husband himself had come to the malt house. Nathaniel struck the door again. "Elinor, if you are inside, answer me." Gideon reached for the trapdoor behind the stacked grain, but Elinor stopped him. "If you disappear now, Vale will move Mary before we can find her. And if the Duke sees me, Vale will know I have spoken. He already knows I saw you. Hiding will only leave him free to decide what that means." Elinor took the iron inventory stamp from the table and slipped it into the inner fold of her dress. Then she crossed the malt house and opened the door. Nathaniel stood outside with his secretary and 4 bailiffs. His anger gave way to shock when he saw her torn gown and bleeding shoulder. "What happened to you?" "Vale's clerk found me watching this building." Nathaniel looked past her at the walls of grain sacks. "You said Vale brought the missing reserve here. I followed his wagon from the mill. The sack he called stolen was carried directly into this warehouse. She stepped aside. Nathaniel entered slowly. He cut open the nearest sack with his pocket knife. Clean wheat spilled between his fingers. The quantity surrounding him was impossible to dismiss. Blackmere had been preparing to borrow money for grain that had never left the estate. Why would Vale conceal it here, he asked. To make Blackmere appear unable to feed itself. Once you borrowed against the Southern Valley, he could force the tenants out and transfer the land to your creditors. That is an accusation, not proof. Elinor placed the iron stamp on the table. This was used to mark the sacks found in my storehouse and inside the mill. The impressions are fresh. Nathaniel examined the narrow crescent along its border. He had seen the same mark in Elinor's ledgers for years. But that stamp was buried with Gideon Pike. No, said a voice behind him. It was taken from me before the funeral. Gideon stepped into the lantern light. One bailiff reached for his club. Nathaniel did not move at all. For several seconds, he stared at the miller whose coffin he had watched descend into the churchyard. You are dead. Vale needed Blackmere to believe that. Nathaniel's shock hardened into suspicion. And why should I trust a man who allowed his own burial? You should not, Gideon replied. I altered the mill tallies. I marked sacks in her grace's name, and I helped Vale hide this grain. Elinor saw Nathaniel seize upon the confession. Then my wife's mark was used by a criminal she met in secret. I did not know he was alive until tonight. Gideon stepped forward. The Duchess had no part in it. Vale threatened someone I could not abandon. Who? My daughter, Mary Shaw. Crow has her near the Northern Canal. Nathaniel knew the name. Mary had been dismissed from Blackmere after a silver spoon was discovered in her belongings. Elinor had asked him to investigate. He had refused. For the first time, uncertainty broke through his anger. Elinor pointed toward the rows of grain. You need not trust Gideon or me. Seal this building, summon Mr. Harland, and place every sack under the magistrate's authority. Then send constables to the Northern Canal before Vale moves Mary. Nathaniel looked toward his secretary. The correct decision stood plainly before him, but so did the consequences. Neighboring landowners were still gathered at Blackmere. Creditors expected an announcement before morning. If Vale were arrested publicly, Nathaniel would have to admit that the advisor he had praised, and the man to whom he had surrendered his wife's authority, had deceived him. Not tonight, he said. Elinor stared at him. Mary may not have until morning. I will send 2 trusted men to search the canal. This warehouse will be guarded until I have questioned Vale privately. Privately? I will not accuse a gentleman of conspiracy before the entire county on the word of a confessed criminal. You accused your wife before the entire county on less. Nathaniel flinched, but his pride recovered quickly. If Vale is guilty, I will act. You are being shown the missing grain, the false stamp, and a man you believe dead. What further permission do you require? He turned to the bailiffs. No one enters or removes anything from this building. Gideon Pike will come with us. Gideon backed away. If Vale sees me in your custody, Mary disappears. Nathaniel hesitated. That moment was enough. A horse galloped into the yard. One of Blackmere's servants nearly fell from the saddle as he dismounted. Your Grace, you must return immediately. The eastern granary is burning. Elinor's blood went cold. The eastern granary contained the original harvest tallies, the records that could prove exactly how much wheat had vanished between the fields and the mill. Vale knows we found this place, she said. Nathaniel looked toward the orange glow rising beyond the trees. He ordered 2 bailiffs to remain at the malt house and took the others back toward Blackmere. Elinor and Gideon followed, but smoke was already rolling across the estate when they reached the eastern yard. Servants carried buckets from the well. Flames poured through the granary roof. Vale stood beside the Duke's men, shouting instructions as though he had arrived to save the building. Nathaniel dismounted and seized his arm. Where is Daniel Crow? Vale's expression remained calm. I sent him to recover the Duchess's stolen correspondence. Elinor stepped toward him. You concealed Blackmere's grain in the old malt house. For the first time, Vale did not answer immediately. Nathaniel saw it. Elinor saw him see it. Then a second servant came running from the darkness. Your Grace, the men guarding the malt house have returned. They said they received your written order to release the warehouse to Lord Vale. I gave no such order, Nathaniel said. The servant held out a folded page bearing the Blackmere seal. Nathaniel opened it beneath the firelight. At the bottom stood his own signature, copied from one of the documents he had signed without reading that morning. Behind them, the eastern granary roof collapsed, carrying Blackmere's original records into the flames. While Nathaniel had delayed to protect his reputation, Vale had destroyed the evidence and recovered the missing grain. Elinor looked at her husband. "This," she said quietly, "is what your hesitation has cost." Nathaniel folded the forged order and faced Vale. "You will remain at Blackmere until the magistrate arrives." Vale glanced toward the burning granary. "On what charge?" "Concealing my grain and using my signature without permission. The grain was moved under contracts your grace approved." Vale produced a document bearing Nathaniel's genuine signature. It authorized him to relocate estate supplies whenever necessary to protect their value. Nathaniel recognized it as one of the papers he had signed without reading. "You used that authority to create a shortage," Elinor said. "That is your interpretation," Vale replied. "The original tallies might have proved otherwise, but unfortunately, they are burning." Nathaniel ordered 2 bailiffs to watch Vale and sent his secretary to summon Mr. Harland. Then he turned to Elinor. "You will return to the house. Mary Shaw is still being held near the Northern Canal. I have sent men to search for her. Men who do not know which buildings Vale used or how grain could be moved without passing through the village." Nathaniel lowered his voice. "The estate is in chaos. I will not have you disappear again. You are still concerned with how my actions appear. I am trying to protect you. You suspended my income, called me dishonest, and gave Vale the authority he used against us. Do not rename control as protection." Nathaniel had no answer. Elinor left him beside the fire and entered Blackmere House. Her maid, Jane, met her near the servants' stairs. "Mr. Crow searched your desk," Jane whispered. "He took Mary Shaw's letters and your survey of the northern waterways." That told Elinor what the burning granary could not. Vale feared Mary's letters because they connected her dismissal to his scheme. He needed the survey because it showed every warehouse and landing along the canal. Elinor retrieved an older copy from beneath the lining of her sewing case. 3 abandoned buildings stood beside the disused northern branch: a toll cottage, an ice house, and the old counting house. Ruth Mercer was waiting in the orchard. "I saw Crow leave during the fire," she said. "He rode north with 2 men and a leather case." "Toward the canal?" Ruth nodded. Elinor looked back at the courtyard. Nathaniel was questioning Vale at last, but questioning him after every original tally had burned would not save Mary or recover the records Crow was carrying. She and Ruth took 2 ponies and followed the towpath. Near the old counting house, fresh wheel tracks descended to the water. A covered barge stood beside the landing, its cargo hold secured with iron bars. A pale hand appeared behind them. Elinor approached quietly. Mary Shaw raised her bruised face from the darkness. "Your Grace," she whispered, "Crow has the true shipping book. It records every sack they took from Blackmere." "Where is it?" Mary pointed toward a light burning beneath the counting house. Through the low window, Elinor saw Crow place a black ledger inside a metal dispatch box. 2 armed men stood beside him. Then Mary's expression changed. "Elinor," Ruth whispered behind her. A pistol had been pressed against Ruth's back. Crow's voice came from the darkness. "His Grace told you to remain at the house." Crow stepped into the lantern light. One of his men held the pistol against Ruth, while the other guarded the barge. "You have caused enough difficulty," he told Elinor. "Give me the inventory stamp." Elinor kept her hands visible. "If the stamp disappears, Vale will blame you for everything: the stolen grain, the forged order, and the fire." Crow's expression tightened. "You carried out his instructions," she continued, "but his name appears on none of the evidence. Yours does. He will protect me." He could not even protect the grain once Nathaniel questioned him. A distant sound reached the canal, several horses approaching along the towpath. Crow looked toward the trees. Elinor understood that Nathaniel's search party was finally near, but Crow's men could still kill Mary and destroy the ledger before help arrived. She removed the iron stamp from her dress. "Release Mary and Ruth, then you may have it." Crow approached, extending his hand. Before he could take the stamp, Gideon emerged from behind the barge and struck the pistol away from Ruth. The weapon discharged into the ground. Crow's second man rushed toward him. Namrian blocked the blow, but fell against the landing, clutching his injured shoulder. Mary forced her arm through the bars and pulled the guard's ring of keys from his belt. She unlocked the hold from inside as Ruth seized the fallen pistol. Elinor ran into the counting house. The metal dispatch box remained beneath the desk. She lifted it just as Crow entered behind her. He caught her by the arm. "If that book reaches the magistrate, Blackmere is finished." "No," Elinor said. "Vale is." Crow raised his hand to strike her, but Mr. Harland's constables entered the room. Nathaniel had sent them north after learning that Crow had taken Elinor's canal survey. Crow released her and attempted to escape through the rear door. Two constables stopped him before he reached the water. Outside, Mary knelt beside Gideon. His wound was painful but not fatal. Mr. Harland opened the dispatch box in the presence of Elinor, Nathaniel's secretary, and the constables. The black ledger contained the true quantities taken from Blackmere, the names of the barges used to move them, and payments made to Crow and Gideon. It also recorded several loans Vale had arranged in Nathaniel's name. Each loan pledged part of the Southern Valley as security. At the bottom of the final page, Vale had written one last instruction: remove the remaining grain before dawn. Lord Mowbray takes possession of the valley at noon. Elinor closed the ledger. They had recovered the evidence and saved Mary, but they had only a few hours to prevent 7 families from losing their homes. Mr. Harland examined the black ledger at the counting house, while his clerk copied the most important pages. The entries support charges of theft, fraud, and unlawful confinement, he said, but they do not automatically cancel the Duke's debts. Nathaniel's secretary looked alarmed. Then Mowbray can still seize the valley? He may attempt it. I can notify him that the contracts are disputed and the principal records have been obtained through suspected fraud. A court must decide the rest. Elinor understood the distinction. Vale could be arrested, yet Nathaniel would remain responsible for the papers he had willingly signed. They returned to Blackmere before dawn. Vale was waiting in the library under guard. Nathaniel placed the ledger before him. You concealed my grain, imprisoned Mary Shaw, and used my debts to seize the Southern Valley. Vale did not deny that the book belonged to his office. Crow managed the shipments. Gideon altered the mill records. If they stole from Blackmere, they acted without my authority. Elinor warned me before any grain disappeared, Nathaniel said. You persuaded me that her figures were false. I advised you. You made the decisions. The answer silenced the room because it was true. Vale had created the scheme, but Nathaniel had given him access, signed the contracts, dismissed Elinor, and destroyed the tenants' protections. Ruth entered carrying the mill's daily receipt book. She had hidden it beneath the grinding floor when the families occupied the building. Elinor compared its figures with the black ledger. Every missing delivery appeared twice, once as wheat received at Blackmere Mill, and again as grain secretly shipped through the Northern Canal. Vale had charged the estate for replacing wheat that had never truly been lost. Mary identified the barges. Gideon identified Vale's payments and instructions. Nathaniel's secretary confirmed that the disputed loan papers had been prepared in Vale's office. Mr. Harland ordered Vale detained while warrants were prepared. As the constables approached, Vale looked at Nathaniel. You wanted influence, solvency, and obedient tenants. I merely showed you how to obtain them. Nathaniel's face tightened. No, Elinor said. You showed him whom he was willing to sacrifice. Before Vale could be removed, the mill bell began ringing across the valley. A tenant boy burst into the house. The outer doors are chained, Your Grace. Several families are trapped inside, and water is rising beneath the wheel. Vale smiled faintly. If I failed to return before dawn, he said, Crow's men were ordered to destroy what remained. Elinor seized the mill keys. The struggle for the evidence was over. Now they had to save the people Nathaniel's decisions had placed in danger. Elinor reached the mill ahead of the constables. Water had risen across the lower yard. The great wheel strained against its brake, shaking the building with each surge. Crow's men had opened the main sluice, blocked the western spillway, and chained the doors from outside. Voices cried from the upper windows. Nathaniel dismounted beside her. Break down the doors. No, Elinor said. If the wheel axle fails while they are beneath it, the machinery will tear through the floor. Then what do we do? For the first time, he asked instead of commanded. Elinor pointed toward the western channel. We'll reduce the water before anyone enters. Ruth knows the inner break. Thomas knows the spillway. You will follow their instructions. Nathaniel looked toward the tenants he had called thieves only hours earlier. Then he nodded. Elinor shouted through an upper window. Ruth appeared behind the bars. Move everyone away from the grinding floor, Elinor called. Then release the inner brake one notch at a time. The lever is wedged, Ruth answered. Outside, Thomas found an iron pin hammered through the spillway mechanism. Nathaniel and 2 bailiffs pulled at it, but it would not move. Use the grain hoist chain, Elinor ordered. They fastened the chain around the pin and attached its other end to a cart horse. Nathaniel took the animal's bridle while Thomas guided the chain. Slowly, Elinor warned. If it breaks free too quickly, the gate will strike the channel wall. The horse pulled. The pin shifted, then tore loose. Thomas lowered the spillway gate. Water thundered into the western channel, carrying branches and mud away from the mill. The pressure against the wheel began to fall. Inside, Ruth freed the brake. The wheel turned once, groaned, and slowed. "Now the doors," Elinor said. Nathaniel and the constables broke the chains. The 7 families emerged, carrying children, tools, and the remaining receipt books. No one had been seriously injured. A constable found one of Crow's men hiding near the sluice. He admitted that Vale had ordered the mill destroyed if the black ledger was recovered. The others had fled before Elinor arrived. Nathaniel stood before the soaked tenants. "I called you thieves," he said. "Yet your knowledge saved this mill after my decisions endangered it." No one answered him. Elinor examined the damaged machinery. The wheel could be repaired, but the grain stored on the lowest floor had been ruined by water. Blackmere would still face hunger unless the reserve at the malt house was recovered quickly. Nathaniel approached her. "I should have listened. You had many opportunities. I know that now. No, you know Vale deceived you. You have not yet faced what you chose to do when I gave you the truth." Before he could respond, carriage wheels sounded on the northern road. Lord Mowbray arrived with his solicitor and 2 creditors. His men carried Nathaniel's signed loan agreements and a notice claiming possession of the southern valley. Mowbray looked at the flooded yard and the families gathered outside the mill. "Whatever crimes Lord Vale committed," he said, "the Duke of Blackmere still accepted my money. Unless the debt is secured by noon, I will ask the court to enforce these agreements." Nathaniel looked toward Elinor, but did not order her to save him. This time the decision belonged to her. Elinor asked Lord Mowbray to examine the records before attempting to take possession. The black ledger showed that Vale had used the same sections of the Southern Valley to secure several different loans. Some contracts described altered boundaries. Others included grain that had already been stolen from Blackmere and sold under another estate's name. Mowbray's solicitor compared the agreements with Ruth's mill receipt book. "If these entries are genuine," he said, "Lord Vale offered security he had already pledged elsewhere." "They are genuine," Mary said. "I watched his men load the grain onto Mowbray's barges." Gideon confirmed that Vale had ordered him to alter the mill tallies. Crow's captured clerk identified the payments recorded beside his name. Mr. Harland warned Mowbray that taking the valley, after receiving notice of suspected fraud, could involve him in the dispute. Mowbray's expression darkened. "I lent money to the Duke of Blackmere," he said. "I did not employ Vale to manufacture a famine." Nathaniel stepped forward. "The signatures are mine." Elinor looked at him. He continued without attempting to excuse himself. "I signed papers I did not read because Vale promised to conceal my debts and advance my political ambitions. My wife warned me that the grain was disappearing. I chose to distrust her because her objections wounded my pride. The tenants, servants, creditors, and neighboring landowners had gathered outside the damaged mill. They now heard the confession from the same man who had condemned Elinor before them." Nathaniel faced the 7 families. "I called you thieves after destroying the agreements that protected your homes. I suspended my wife's income, removed her authority, and accused her without allowing her to examine the evidence. Vale exploited those decisions, but he did not make them for me." No one applauded. Public truth did not erase public harm. Mowbray withdrew his demand for immediate possession. His claim would be examined with the other disputed contracts, while Nathaniel remained liable for any money he had legitimately received. Vale was taken away under guard with Crow. Gideon surrendered voluntarily. His cooperation and the threats against Mary would be considered, but they would not erase his responsibility for falsifying records or delaying the repairs that had killed 2 workers. Nathaniel ordered new leases prepared for the 7 families. This time, they would be reviewed by an independent solicitor before anyone signed them. Then he turned to Elinor. "Your authority over the mill and stores will be restored." "No," she said. The word carried across the yard. Nathaniel appeared wounded. "You spent years building them, and you removed me with one accusation. I will not accept authority that remains dependent upon your approval." "What do you require?" "A legal arrangement you cannot revoke when another advisor appeals to your vanity. The mill must be managed by trustees, with the tenants represented. My income and personal property must be placed beyond your control." Nathaniel held her gaze. "And us?" Elinor looked at the flower still clinging to the hem of the gown in which he had disgraced her. "You will correct every accusation you made against me. After that, my solicitor will prepare terms for our separation." Only then did Nathaniel understand that exposing Vale had saved Blackmere, but it had not saved their marriage. The investigation continued beyond that morning. Mr. Harland sealed Vale's accounts, the black ledger, the altered contracts, and the surviving mill records. Vale and Crow were committed for trial on charges connected to fraud, theft, arson, forgery, and Mary's unlawful confinement. Gideon surrendered and gave a full statement. The threats against Mary explained his obedience, but did not absolve him of falsifying records or delaying the repairs that had caused 2 deaths. His cooperation would be considered when his case was heard. The disputed loans were sent for legal review. Lord Mowbray's claim to immediate possession remained suspended after the evidence showed that Vale had pledged the same land to several creditors. Nathaniel was still responsible for the money he had genuinely received. He sold his unentailed horses, carriages, London furnishings, and other luxuries to begin repaying it. The political appointment Vale had promised disappeared as soon as the scandal became public. Nathaniel also sent written corrections to every landowner, creditor, and official who had received his accusations against Elinor. In each letter, he admitted that she had neither stolen grain nor falsified the estate accounts. Before the tenants, he executed new leases protecting the 7 families from arbitrary eviction and sudden rent increases. An independent solicitor reviewed every page before the tenants signed. Management of the mill and emergency grain stores was placed under 3 named trustees: Elinor, the solicitor, and a representative chosen by the tenant families. Nathaniel could not dismiss them or alter the accounts alone. He then met Elinor in the library where she had first shown him the missing grain. Her solicitor placed a deed of separation on the desk. It secured her separate maintenance through trustees, restored the income owed under her marriage settlement, returned her papers and possessions, and recorded Nathaniel's agreement not to interfere with her residence or compel her return to his household. Nathaniel read every page. It was the first important document Elinor had seen him examine without impatience. When he finished, he signed. "I cannot undo what I did," he said. "No, but I will repair whatever remains within my power." "That is repair," Elinor replied. "It is not reconciliation." Pain crossed his face, but he did not ask her to soften the answer. Elinor moved to a modest house near the northern canal, close enough to supervise the rebuilding of the mill, but beyond Nathaniel's household authority. Ruth Mercer managed the tenant accounts. Mary, after testifying against Vale, assisted with the canal shipments. A new miller was appointed under safety rules written with the workers who operated the machinery. 6 months later, Blackmere Mill reopened. Nathaniel attended, but stood among the invited landowners rather than beside Elinor. He had fulfilled the terms of their separation and had not treated obedience as a claim upon her forgiveness. At noon, Elinor climbed to the bell platform. On the night of her disgrace, the bell had sounded while desperate families barricaded themselves inside. Now she pulled the rope once, and the repaired wheel began to turn. Clean flour poured into waiting sacks. The old inventory stamp bearing Elinor's initial had been retired. Its replacement showed 7 sheaves bound together, one for each family Nathaniel had nearly driven from the valley. Elinor handed the first sack to Ruth. No flour lay scattered at her feet. No husband stood above her passing judgment. She opened the mill doors herself, and the families entered a building they now had the legal right to serve, protect, and call their own.